Hello, and welcome to the American Martial Arts Alliance Legends Celebration Weekend. My name is Dana Abbott, and I will assist you on Hoppo Giddy and its practical application. For centuries, man has wielded a sword, and especially in Japan, they've turned it into an art and a science. Through the Japanese, we have discovered that there are lots of different angles to cut with that were perfected through these guys. The interesting thing about the katas is we've seen in the Toyama or the Seitei or Aomori-gyu or hundreds of different types of styles out there. They all have one thing in common, and that is Hoppo Giddy, the 8 basic cutting patterns. The 8 basic cutting patterns aren't that difficult, but when you think about it too deeply, it becomes a little bit more overbearing. So what we're going to do is we're going to adjust everything today and make it simple. And while you're in quarantine, we can work with you on that so you can practice over and over and over again until your rote memory sets in. And that's the thing that we have to consider, having your rote memory set in. As I said earlier, say you're doing a kata, let's say the Toyama kata. There's 8 katas. Inside the 8 katas, there's usually 1 to 3 cuts per kata. After you've done the 8 katas in that series, it usually takes about 4.5 minutes, and you get 18 to 20 cuts, which is normal with most all sword systems developed by Japanese. If you look at that, it teaches you how to use your mind, your mindset, how to stand, how to use your posture, how to make your cuts. But there's one thing it is lacking. It is lacking in repetition. It takes a long time to do 20 cuts. Therefore, when they developed Hoppo Giddy and its practical application, instead of doing like 20 cuts in like 4 or 5 minutes, you can do 20 to 30 cuts a minute. And that's what is great about this, because it sets everything up and you get that repetition and practice that your muscle memory needs. For example, if you look at any sword system, they have their 8 basic cuts, and they all have their own separate little patterns in these 8 basic cuts. But here is a cutting pattern that most everybody in swordsmanship will see, and it is probably the most used Hoppo Giddy cutting pattern for the average swordsman out there. And that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And then that breaks you back into a center. In executing Hoppo Giddy, you can be very tight in your cuts and cut from here to here, for example, or your cuts can be long and flowy. It really doesn't matter, because there are lots of different aspects and mindsets to Hoppo Giddy. So if you want to be nice and flowy, if you want to be hard and tight, you can do either which way or anything in between. Because what this does is, if you enjoy it, you will continue and practice even harder. A lot of times when you're eating peas with the sword, you just don't want to do it. But if you get a nice way to be able to execute lots of cuts, and you can feel yourself, what would we say, becoming proficient on the right side and the left side, now that's something that is very, very commendable. Moreover, when you work with Hoppo Giddy, you get a 360-degree radius of how you can defend your circle of influence. As earlier, when I showed you the demonstration of like this just a couple of minutes ago with the Hoppo Giddy, it was just doing this one section, which is nice. The difficult part about doing the Hoppo Giddy just on, say, one wall is that it gets boring after a few minutes, because you have no concept of turning, you have really no concept of moving, because you're just swinging against the wall. Unless you start taking the 4 corners. Now in Hoppo Giddy, there's 8 corners, but usually when we're quarantined, we're going to be working inside of a room, which is usually square or a long rectangle. Let's just call it a square for right now to make it easier. When we first start out, 8 angles is really hard to comprehend, because you're turning 180 degrees to 135. So we're going to simplify this. And we're going to simplify it with only 4 sides to begin with, so you can grasp the basics of it. The first cut we're going to do is the one that's mostly used, and that is the vertical cut. So watch what I'm going to do, and you will do the same thing, and back to 90, 180 degrees, back to 90, 180 degrees, back to 90, 180 degrees, back to 90. So you can see how easy this pattern is. You can go around in circles back and forth a lot, which will cover your turns and make it a point to, as I said earlier, is be proficient on your right and your left side. After you finish working on the vertical cut, then you have to worry about polishing your diagonal cuts, because diagonal cuts are the most used. The vertical cut is the first cut you ever learn, but the diagonal cuts are the ones that are mostly used within the realm of Hoppo Giddy and, of course, Japanese swordsmanship. So, watch the difference now. Instead of coming straight down, I'm going to come in at an angle to here. And then I'm going to lift up and cut off my left side. Lift up, cut off my right. Lift up, cut off my left. Lift up, cut off my right. And I'm turning 180 degrees and I'm cutting down this way. So now you can see that when I'm cutting at different angles, I'm doing the right side and the left side, just because it follows the way of my body. Now here's something else I'd like you to think of. If we're doing downward cuts, we also have to do upward diagonal cuts. So if I come down here in a walkie no kamae and I cut up like this, then I start the whole process, and I'll go around one time to show you upward diagonal cuts. And 90 degrees, 180 degrees, 90 degrees, 180 degrees, 90 degrees, 180 degrees, 90 degrees, and you can see we're right back here again. That's the nice thing about dealing with just 4 walls at this time. That's because you can go around, you can actually see yourself in relation to the room. Now here's another part I want you to think about, is your focal points. Usually your focal points, if you don't have any, you're pretty diffuse. So I would say take a piece of tape or take a little Post-it and put it at about eye level on the walls. So every time you turn and you face the wall, your eyes and your target is on that focal point. This will keep you from looking down and sparring midgets and fighting things that don't make any sense, because if I start looking down, my back will naturally bend and look forward, and I can't protect myself 360 degrees, or at least have the zanshin to understand what's behind me. And that is also very, very important. On the other directions, we have a downward, and then we worked an upward. Well, let's put those together in Hoppo Giddy and practice this. Now, remember, I'm only practicing this maybe 5 or 6 cuts going around. When you practice, you're going to be practicing for hours at a time. But there's one important aspect, and that is, if you make a mistake, don't dwell on it. Just go on to the next one and keep going and going until you're running like the wind, or you're spinning like a top, or you're smooth enough where your transitions and everything's set up very, very nicely. So now let's do Hoppo Giddy, a down and up. So diagonal down, bring it up, cut up, turn 180 degrees, and down and up. 90 degrees, down and up. 180 degrees, down and up. 90 degrees, down and up. 180 degrees, down and up. Now we're starting to see some patterns coming through here. Before we were just going like this through the motions, but now you're getting to see new real estate. You're being able to set up every time and make the cuts correctly, because that's really important. See, it isn't really the strength of the swing of the cut. It isn't really the way you push the sword out there. Actually, it's setting up. Swordsmanship is almost like playing tennis. If you don't win on the serve, you'll be put in difficulty. So remember, if you can set up perfectly, casting the sword shouldn't be that difficult. Think about that. The most important aspect is the setup, so even though you're angled correctly, you can always fall on the target and the blade will do its work no matter what. And that's another important aspect I want you to see, that the blade doesn't cut itself, but if you put it in the general direction and use your hips correctly, it will do what you want it to do. The next cut we have are your horizontal cuts. Now, they're not used as much as the diagonal or the vertical cuts, but nevertheless they have their place. And if I come down here and I have a horizontal cut, I'm going to start here. Now I'm going to turn 180 degrees and make a cut. Turn 90 degrees, make a cut. Turn 180 degrees, make a cut. Turn 90 degrees, make a cut. Turn 180 degrees and make another cut. So you can see that I'm starting to move back and forth. And when I set up this way, see how nice and tall my stature is? Or when I come around this way, you can see that it's consistent. So looking here at the camera or looking over here, I should have the exact same stance, posture, and movements. Just because the longer I practice, the more I become a machine. No, the more my muscle memory sets in, where I start acting like a machine and I get the job done with the smallest effort. And that's another important fact. If you're sucking up air and if you're making wrong angles on your cuts, you'll find out that you fatigue too easily. So now, what we're going to do is, we're going to take the two cuts, the down and upward diagonal cut, and we're going to apply a horizontal cut on it, just to get to see what happens. Ready? And down, up, side. You notice what I'm doing. I'm not overflowing it. I could go down, up, and side, and go really wide. But if you choose to, please try that, because you need to practice and understand every angle and every fullness of every cut and cast. But for me, I'm going to keep it parallel to the ground. So I'll keep it parallel here when it's above my head. I'll keep it parallel here, even if it's in an angle or vertical. I'll keep it parallel here, off my hips. See, if my hip is here, I'll just bring the sword here or here. So you can see that your other focal points, you can stop right there and keep it tight onto the target. And that's a very important fact, because you can cut through the target like this, but if I miss, I'm open. But if I cut through the target and I miss, I can still come in and stab. So take that into consideration also, because remember, while we're learning Hoppo Giddy, our opponents are learning Hoppo Giddy, and if we make a mistake, they'll take great advantage of it. Down, up, side. 180 degrees. Down, up, side. 90 degrees. Down, up, side. Up, down, up, side. Down, up, side. And bring it back down for down, up, side. So now we're starting to get these patterns that aren't that difficult, but it will take your muscle memory a long time. And another thing I want to emphasize is, in your head, you'll have it today. In your body, it's going to take some time. So even though so far we've gone through our vertical, our downward and upward diagonals, and also our horizontal cuts, right at the very beginning, I figured your first 5,000 to 10,000 strikes will be diagonal. No, it won't be horizontal either. They'll be vertical cuts, because this is going to set you up in your body perfectly, and that's a very important factor on doing that. Now, when we get over to the footwork, what do we do with the footwork? Because that's pretty good. You can see me moving back and forth, but how are my feet working? There are lots of martial arts out there, and lots of different stances, and lots of different footwork. With swordsmanship, the footwork is so simple that people make stuff up just to make it more difficult. Because if you think about it, in the heat of battle, and this was all made for battle, in the heat of battle, you don't want to have to think about what foot or what thing to do here if you get thrown or whatever. You want to make sure that your stuff is very aggressive. Now, of course, we'll look at some arts, like softer arts, like Aikido, which also use the sword, but they use more of a defensive one. Usually, we'll learn a couple of katas where their feet are turned inward this way so they can move the sword and then take someone and roll them. In general swordsmanship, we don't want to touch anybody but with the tip of the sword. So when you're practicing, you have to remember it's all offensive, it's not defensive. You're a Marine and you're out there taking over. You're out there taking the bull by the horns, because if you don't, swordsmanship isn't your thing. If you want to be a little bit more, let's say, defensive, I would say stay with a defensive sword style, which are few and far between, but nevertheless, if you see your seiza toho, where you're usually in a kneeling position, you can do a lot of interesting artwork with that. Usually the stand-up versions, what most Americans have to do, because staying in a seiza or kneeling position, most people won't last more than 10 minutes. And the people that last more than 10 minutes, you can see in their eyes, they're in pain just because their knees are hurting. So if we practice a stand-up art, it'll be great. Because most of us didn't start the art or kenjutsu or start kneeling on the ground like Japanese do when we were 3 or 4 or 2. We started practicing the art when we were 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. So we have to take that in consideration too, where we really need to stand or learn how to stay on our knees, which is a difficult process. Okay, now, let me get off my tangent here and start with our footwork. I'm going to put down the sword. I'm going to bring up the hakama here, tuck it in. Okay, now, if you see my feet, I'm going to come over here at this side. I'm just going to jump up and down. Ready? And just like this. I'll do it forward. And that's where my feet are. That's where my stance is. This is my own personal stance. You do the same. Everybody will have a stance that's within an inch or 2. So I'm going to come over to the side here. I'm going to jump again a little bit like this. Now look at my feet. I'm going to take my right foot and I'm going to pull it forward just a little bit. So if you can see this, my big toe will go into the arch of the other foot there like that. That's my stance. Basically, it's just a walking stance. If I'm starting to walk like this, see, the military was made, they didn't have tanks 1,000 years ago. They had people who walked. And if you walked and you were attacked, you'd have to follow off that walking pattern, draw your sword, and go at what was coming to you. So you have to take those aspects into consideration. So to keep this simple, here we are here, my footwork. If I turn now, I'm just going to turn 180 degrees. See my feet? And this other one comes up. If I do it slow, it looks a little awkward, but I'll do back this way, and I come in. Now if I do it fast, but then you ask, well, which way do you go? Always follow the rear foot. If your left foot is, you start off, and your left foot is in the rear, then turn 180 degrees, and then you start your 90, 180, 90, 180, 90, 180. And that's how I want you to see the footwork. Always make sure that your heels are bladed out a little bit, because if they stay like this and you turn, your turn's going to be on a 50-cent piece. But if your feet are turned in a little bit more pigeon-toed, and you have your heels angled out a tad, now you can easily turn on a dime. And the tighter the turn is, the better the cast, which is a very important factor in Hoppo Giddy. Now, let's go on to the next section. And that is gripping, grasping, and holding the sword. There are tons of ways to hold the sword. But when you start practicing this fast, you have to keep your hands nice and supple without telegraphing your thoughts and intentions. And when you're bringing your sword, you're bringing it down here and you're making a cut, or you're cutting upwards, for example, or if you're cutting over on the side, you notice my fingers aren't really moving as much, are they? Whereas if we see a lot of other people, they come in and they move their hands here and they bring it up and they move their hands here, they lift it up here and they're always moving their hands a little bit because it feels comfortable. What's happening is if I hold this tight here and I cut down here, my hands are tight. I turn it around and push out like this, my hands are tight. It's not comfortable for most people in their forearms. That's why they let go. But they lose what they call shibori, which is called wringing the handle, which is very important on making sure the tip of the sword is stronger. So you have to take that in consideration. It'll take a long time to understand it, but if you have questions about shibori and how to wring the handle, you can consult one of my other tutorials. But back to Hoppo Giddy here. Since we're going to be turning back and forth like a washing machine like this, or a rainbird water sprinkler go like this, moving back and forth, making sure everything's perfect, we might as well learn how to hold with our hands. Now, of course, we just grasp it, and if you see my other tutorials, we talk about grasping it. But what I want you to know is that instead of just grasping it and making this a sword, I want you to be a mechanical unit where you're holding up a metal pipe or a wood sword or whatever, and you grasp it in your brackets. So I want you to turn your hand like this or like this into a bracket. So instead of grasping it and bending here at the knuckles, I'm going to leave it open like this and keep the knuckles straight. So now my hand will fit into there like this, and look at this movement I have. This will assist me on my cutting. So if I'm lifting it up, it's going. When it comes down, it has that little bit of movement there. But the nice thing about it is that this here squeezes it when it needs to and loosens up when it needs to. So if I'm doing any transitioning, I'm keeping my hand a little loose here, and when I'm striking, I just bring it in. And it isn't noticeable. You know, a lot of times you're like this, and all of a sudden you're going to strike, you hold like this, and you're back up like this. That's not the case. I want you to be more like a python, and you have this really strong grip around the handle. But you loosen it up just a little bit. And then you squeeze again a little harder. You can't see with the naked eye, but the sword will really be... But the sword will really be able to be wielded a lot differently because the tip will be stronger. And that is a very important factor when you're setting up. So, away from the hands, if I come up here like this and I cut down, see my hands. I'm going to turn 180 degrees, 90 degrees, 180 degrees, 90 degrees. And you can see my hands are so simple. With my feet, now, the process of Hoppo Giddy isn't that difficult. It's just trying to make the left foot work before the right, and make sure the right hand doesn't squeeze too hard before the left. So after we've worked on all these cuts, let's go back to the vertical cut for a second. And we're going to be on 4. So I'm going to sit up here, I'm going to cut, come around, and then I'm just going to start practicing. Just like this. It's what I want you to do. Especially after this is done and you play this over and over again. But you're noticing now that I'm simply just coming up, lifting up the sword and dropping it. You're also noticing that I'm making a cut, I'm nice and straight. I come over here, I'm making a cut, exact same cut. I'm bringing it over here, exact same cut. How am I able to do that? Well, I'm not pushing the sword into place. I'm pulling the sword into place. So if my back foot is back like this, I'm not going to push the sword this way with this hand. I'm going to take my back leg with my hand that's with it, and I'm going to pull it into place. See how that works? And then make the cut. If I do it verse, I lift up the sword like this. Here my hand is. I bring it in, I pull it right into place. Otherwise, if I take it and I push it into place, it might not go. And what happens is when you push it into place, it usually comes about right here. But when you pull it into place, it comes up to the top axis of your head because your left hand is on your left side and you're bringing it over, or vice versa. And that is another very important point that I want you to work on when you start practicing Hoppo Giddy, is to make sure your feet are simple, your hands are simple, and you're setting up correctly. Now, other things on setting up correctly. As I said, you pull it into place, but also make sure that you're getting as tall as you are. If you're 5'8", be 6'2", because the taller you are, the farther you can cast. And the farther you can cast, the smoother it will become. So if I set up like this, and I'm here like hunkered down, it's great. But if I'm standing up straight and I set up like this, and my feet are really down, and I can really cast out really, really far, which is another important aspect of swordsmanship. Because the primo shots right off the top, when kids this big are starting to be taught swordsmanship in Japan, is a full cast, vertical cut right down to the head. That's their primo shot, primo cut. So with that, let's take it to the next level, which is Hoppo Giddy. All the time we've been working now is we've been working on the 4 walls. Now is the time to work on 4 walls and 4 corners. So now this makes it twice as hard. It's like going from a 4-banger engine over to a V8, because now you're going to start seeing smoothness and you're going to start seeing transitions. And at the very beginning, you'll get a little, right foot, left foot, I don't know where I am, but don't worry about that as much, because this exercise is made for you to fail. You're there to make all the mistakes. You're there to set up poorly. You're there to hold it poorly. You're there for bad footwork. But over time and polish, it will look good and you'll become more of a machine. And that's very important when you're casting out and striking. So now Hoppo Giddy is the 8 corners. And let's start with a wall. Wall to wall. Now I come back 135 degrees, I go to the corner. 180, I come back to the corner. 135, I'm at the wall. 180, I'm at this wall. 135, I'm at the corner. 180, I'm at the other corner. 135, I'm at this corner. And of course, set back up. 180, back this way. So that is the beginning of Hoppo Giddy on the 8 basic directions. Now these 8 basic directions have more meaning than I'm talking about. So what I'd like you to do is just polish, practice. Now remember when we were going and we were first started talking about the first Hoppo Giddy, where it's just staring at one wall and you're cutting here, and a vertical and then downward and upward diagonal, and then sideways and going through those patterns? Well, you can do that in Hoppo Giddy and do it on all the corners. So, for example, if I come down in here and I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then see how that works? And then it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. See how that works? And you can go back and forth that way. But that's going to be down the road because it gets very, very difficult. So let's go back and let's stay with the first cut, your primo cut. And that is a vertical downward cut from 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock. And let me put a couple of repetitions in here. And so you start to see the repetitions there. You can see I could probably do 40 cuts within that, and I'm not even breathing hard. So that's what I want you to take into consideration when you're learning the sword. It's if you just pull out the sword and go, oh, it feels good, and you make it good, I'm good for 2 weeks now. That's nice. But when you run against someone who practices an hour or 2 every day, do their 10,000 cuts a week, yeah, those guys are really formidable. They don't cut. They control you with the tip of the sword. And that's very offensive. So Another thing that I want you to look at is when we're doing Hoppo Giddy, we want to start putting in faster repetition. So watch how I'm going to do this. I'm going to cut slow, but I'm going to put in a fast setup so you can see the importance of a setup. So here I am here. I'll just keep it simple. And I set up, I cut slow. 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 I set up, I cut slow, and of course, I set up and I cut slow. Take that also into consideration when you're setting up. And remember also, before you make the cut, don't cut corners. Make sure your foundation, your stance, and your posture is perfect before you make the cut. You might even want to do this. Come over here and then all of a sudden up. Am I good? My feet turned, everything here. I'm standing up, and then make the cut. And then when you turn the other way and you bring it up and it doesn't feel right or you feel like you cut a corner, set it up straight, hold it in. Okay, now I feel pretty good. My feet are turning, and then execute the cut. Because this isn't about you being perfect today. This is about you being proficient down the road. On the right side, the left side, at 360 degrees. So now, what I'd like us to do is, if we're setting down and setting up again, let's do it with different words. Watch this. Down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up. So if you start using only two words like down and up, it will take the feeling of swordsmanship away a little bit. But it will teach you to cut down and bring the sword up. So set up, bring the sword down. So simplify your mindset too. A lot of times we think too deep into this, which means that we turn it into something busier than it needs to be. As you well know, in lots of other martial arts too, you practice one punch on one kata, or you practice a technique or a throw, and then over time, getting better and smoother, you go, well, wait a minute. I could have just swept the leg instead of using my brawn to throw it over. I could have used my hips and a little bit more technique to throw them off balance. Whereas at the very beginning, you use brute force. Same thing with the sword. You can use brute force and get in there and fatigue, or you can have your finesse, stand up tall, cast well, and Hoppo Giddy will start coming to you. Now let's take Hoppo Giddy to the next level and apply it to some katas. My teacher's teacher, Nakamura Kaizaburo sensei, he was knighted by the emperor, and he was a World War II vet that took the Toyama system and made it known to most everybody in the world who looks at different sword styles. So he was really, really good as far as practical application, and since he was a World War II vet, his practical application was really used in battle. So what I'm saying here is that if you do Hoppo Giddy and you adjust it to a kata that is in Hoppo Giddy, it makes a big difference on understanding the brevity of weaponry and the simplicity of it. So Nakamura Kaizaburo sensei, he developed 8 katas, of course, on the basic 8 with the 8 Hoppo Giddy directions, and I'll do a couple of them. We'll do them together, and let's make this really, really easy. The first one is the one we're going to do is on a hasso. So we're going to step forward, bring up to a hasso here. And then from here, we're going to step forward and make a downward cut, and then a horizontal cut. We're going to lift the sword up in the air and make a step and set up again, and now make a large cast to complete the cut. And of course, the kata. So you go back into a center stance, reverse your hand, for example, bring it up and stand into it. Same thing with the other side. You come up with your right foot, you hold this into a hostile position, And of course, you step forward with the weight of your body and you get in there and do a short cut, a medium cut, lift it up in the air above your head as you're stepping with your right foot, setting up, and then with your left foot, you're making a diagonal cut, a full one, all the way down like this, and then standing into it. So what I want us to work on is the form a little bit. For example, how to work on happo and those aspects. Well, first of all, a lot of us come over here and we do happo, and we usually bring it up to our sides like this. Most of us we take our elbows and we pull it back like this. If I go around here, you can see my elbows are back and this is close to my chest, and I try to keep this as straight as possible, and it looks pretty good, and the blade's on, and your hands are here. But in reality, what happened to your triangle? What happened to the air between you and the sword that's your protection? So here's how I want you to work on a happo, just a little bit different. Take it out to a center stance, and then from the center stance, bring it back this way. Now, if you notice when I'm bringing it back, I'm bringing my forearms together. This isn't easy. Bring your forearms together, and that sets up onto your chest and your left side. So if you want to do a low happo or a higher happo or a one-handed happo, it's all in that area ready to cast. And that's the secret, being able to cast correctly so you don't telegraph your thoughts and intentions. So now we're up here with a kata. We're going like this. And you notice I'm not moving my hands around as much. I don't want you to adjust them like that anymore. I want you to stay sort of true and tight. And bring your elbows together so you're a little bit off the ground. See how I'm bringing them together? And now the sword is in place. And this way you can easily just bend forward. If you look at my arms here, just bending forward like this. Before, when my arms were back like this, I had to push out and adjust it a few times to get it on target. But now, since my forearms together and I'm wringing the handle really hard, my elbows are like hinges. All they have to do is just drop onto the target. See the simplicity of it. That's what Hoppo Giddy designs and shows you how practical application is easily done. So now, we're up here like this, the sword's in the set, my arms are a little bit closer, and when I first take my first step, I'm going to get in there and I'm going to do 2 hard, fast cuts. 1, 2, like this. In the kata, of course, you only step 1 step, but in Hoppo Giddy, practical application doesn't stop on just 1 step. So it's understood that if you need to chase down somebody, make sure you're chasing them down with the tip of the sword on them. A lot of times when someone chases down someone, they're up here like this, going like this, and the sword's riding around. But when they get to them, they have to adjust. This way keeps the sword on target. And when the sword stays on target, this is your biggest defensive area. Remember, if the sword is in someone's face, they'll try to work around it. If it isn't in their face, they'll come straight on you. At this angle here, and ya. Up, reverse hand, stand into it. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Again, and happo. Make sure your arms are up in place a little bit more. It will feel funny keeping these arms together a little bit. You'll see a lot of pulling in these arms. And setting up, and ya. Up, down, and reverse hand, and set into it. Same thing with the other side. But we just take an extra step. And it's 1, 2, everything's set up, and ya, set in. See how I'm walking into it like this, even on the other side. So you have to remember, when you practice this, and especially the Nakamura view, it is on both sides. So you can practice one to the other. And that's very nice when you're practicing your right side, but your left side just doesn't get as much practice as it needs. This way, you can be proficient on both sides, because if you're proficient with your left hand, it's like fighting a southpaw. They're not that easy, because all of a sudden the hand comes out of nowhere where you're not expected to block it, because you don't fight too many left-handed people. Same thing with a sword. If you're fighting on the left-handed side, everybody gets thrown into difficulty unless they are proficient. And ya, and bring it in and set it in. I'll bring it over here at an angle so you can see it at an angle. And we'll do the right side. Set it up and ya. Reverse hand, set it in. Now if I bring it over here on this side and ya. And then bring it in like this. So that is 2 katas out of Nakamura Sensei's Hoppo Giddy series. And working on this really makes it easy, because the next 2 katas are from Wakis. They're basically the same pattern. They were used through the military. See, that's the nice thing about this Hoppo Giddy series and the Toyama Ryu and the Nakamura Ryu is these were all made by people that used them in practical application during the war. There are many, many styles out there. Of course, there are tons of styles that were really polished during peacetime. And during peacetime, you learn how to be, of course, poised and nice and tall and cast, but you learn how to be artistic. In real life, it's not as artistic as you think it is. And this way helps you have the sword tip where it needs to be, where you are. And that's a very important factor. So to rehash all this, we've gone over 2 katas, very basically, on Nakamura Taizaburo's sensei's system there. And of course, we've done Hoppo Giddy, which has been around for a long time, but he put emphasis on this. His version of Hoppo Giddy is the 8 movements of the calligraphy pen. So when you write into it, and when you do the katas, it also gives you practical application, but also the artistic venue of being. That's what it is. So with that, I hope you enjoyed your seminar, and I hope you pulled just a little bit of information out of this where you can apply it at home in your own room. And with that, let's start doing a little bit of Hoppo Giddy.